Good afternoon and welcome to the first public lecture and opening address under the auspices of the School of Criticism and Theory's 42nd summer session. My name is Hen de Vries, and in my role as Director of SET, it is my great pleasure and distinct honor to introduce to you our first plenary speaker, Professor Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha received his education at the University of Bombay, Mumbai, and at Christ Church College, Oxford, where he completed his doctoral thesis on V.S. Naipaul. He subsequently taught English and Humanities at the Universities of Sussex and Warwick, as well as at the University of Chicago, with visiting positions at the University of Pennsylvania, Princeton University, and University College London, before taking up his current position. Since 2001, Professor Bhabha serves as the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in the Department of English, and as Director of the Manhindra Humanities Center at Harvard University, where he is also the Senior Advisor on the Humanities to the President and Provost. Professor Bhabha, who taught at SET when it was hosted still at Dartmouth College, is also a member of the Board of Senior and Honorary Fellows at SET, which is the body of distinguished former faculty and former directors that appoints and oversees the work of the director and supervises the general orientation of the school. In other words, he is one of my bosses and esteemed mentors. Professor Bhabha is the author of numerous works exploring post-colonial theory, cultural change, and power, while imagining different articulations of cosmopolitanism, among other themes. Among his groundbreaking works, I will mention the titles that have, in the meantime, become true classics, such as the much-used edited volume Nation and Narration, published in 1990 by Routledge, and The Location of Culture, which first came out 4 years later and was reprinted as a Routledge classic in 2004 with a remarkable and illuminating new preface about which I will say a bit more, drawing some telling quotes from it in a moment. Nation and Narration was deeply programmatic and certainly deserves mentioning here at Cornell, which after all is the university where Benedict Anderson wrote his 1983 classic Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism, in which he claimed that the nation state, in the context of the post-Enlightenment and rationalist secularism, gave political expression to, quote, what looms out of an immemorial past and glides into a limitless future, end of quote. Anderson, you may recall, proposed that nationalism, as he put it, quote, has to be understood by aligning it not with self-consciously held political ideologies, but with large cultural systems that preceded it, out of which, as well as against which, it came into being, end of quote. In a similar vein, Homi Bhabha opens Nation and Narration with an intriguing, provocative insight, declaring that, and I quote again, nations, like narratives, lose their origins in the myth of time and only fully encounter their horizons in the mind's eye, end of quote. One should keep this background claim firmly in mind and then further think of the powerful essay opening the book, The Location of Culture, an essay famously entitled The Commitment to Theory, which dismisses the claim that theory is, quote, necessarily the elite language of the socially and culturally privileged, end of quote, whose academic register dwells, and I quote again, within the Eurocentric archives of an imperialist or neo-colonial West, end of quote. Such reverse essentialism, Bhabha intimates, does not register the value of anxious ambivalence and across-the-board hybridity that runs throughout culture, virtually all the way down and up, and that finds its expression in colonialism, post-colonialism, and this, it would seem, in historical and political configurations that date back well before modernity, before the Enlightenment, just as they may well extend far beyond it. Such an insight, Professor Bhabha makes us see and appreciate, therefore requires a far more attentive reading, exploration, and strategic exploitation of so-called liminal or interstitial spaces in and between competing cultural traditions, in and between historical periods, and lest we forget, also in and between the critical methodologies that are used to study them. After all, it is precisely these spaces that, quote, enable a capacity for resistance in performative mimicry, end of quote. For example, in the sudden, fortuitous discovery of the English book. I'm quoting again from The Location of Culture. Thus, for example, the Bible or the novel, like any other layer of located culture, also reveals something more and other than European imperial or colonial dominance, and offers conceptual, imaginative, and pragmatic tools and levers for the latter's subversion, no less than for its ongoing rule. I quote, "If the effect of colonial power is seen to be as the production of hybridization, rather than the noisy command of colonialist authority, or the silent repression of native traditions, then an important change of perspective occurs. The ambivalence at the source of traditional discourses on authority enables a form of subversion founded on the undecidability that turns the discursive conditions of dominance into the grounds of intervention," end of quote. In other words, the genealogy of cultural studies goes hand in hand here with a profound philosophical, if I dare say even metaphysical insight, thus perhaps anticipating the so-called ontological turn in recent anthropological debate that we discussed in this particular context last year after Philippe Descolin's compelling lecture. Deeply influenced by the work of Edward Said and the author of a lucid introduction to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Homi Bhabha has redefined the field of theory in its post-colonial guises and well beyond, by providing it with some of the most original of its critical terms, of which across-the-board hybridity, anxious ambivalence, and subversive mimicry are only the best known. Let me also mention Bhabha's 2010 Hegel lectures, the first in that series to be organized by the Humanities Center at the Free University of Berlin, and published by De Gruyter in 2011 under the title Our Neighbors, Ourselves, Contemporary Reflections on Survival. These lectures are, quote, an attempt to understand the contemporary issues of ethical witness, historical memory, and the rights and representation of minorities in the cultural sphere, end of quote. Effectively asking, and I'll quote again, who is our neighbor today? What does hospitality mean for our times? Why is the recognition of others such an agonizing encounter with the alterity of the self? End of quote. And there is, I think, no need to explain the painful actuality of these profound meditations, given what goes on these days in this country in matters of immigration policy. The lectures further elaborate on Bhabha's fundamental concept of the so-called third space, which he proposes can help us establish, I quote, a new understanding of cosmopolitanism and hospitality in a globalized world, based on the right of difference in equality, end of quote. This latter notion is that of the right of difference in equality was first introduced by Etienne Balibar, and it articulates what Bhabha very helpfully calls a vernacular, or also a translational cosmopolitanism, by which he means a concept and practice that, quote, measures global progress from the minoritarian perspective, end of quote. After all, he notes in an interview, and I cite him again, the experience of minoritization in general can make us question some of the norms and values that we take for granted, end of quote. Or again, far more concretely even, a right to difference in equality can be articulated from the perspective of both national minorities and global migrants. And in each case, such right represents a desire to revise the customary components of citizenship, political, legal, and social citizenship, by precisely extending them to include the realm of symbolic citizenship, end of quote. And this is a term, symbolic citizenship, that Bhabha borrows from last year's SET faculty member Avishai Margalit. And yet, symbolic citizenship, Bhabha claims, is in the current context of world disorder increasingly challenged and threatened by what he calls a surveillance culture of security, which seeks to tell the good immigrant from bad immigrant, and constantly sees itself forced to ask, and I quote, which cultures are safe, which unsafe, end of quote. In 2016, Professor Bhabha was the generous and inspiring host of the 40th anniversary meeting of SET's board at Harvard University, where he moderated a day-long conference on the then and now topical subject of criticism and theory in an age of populism. And far beyond that, Homi has been a staunch and trusted advocate of the role and importance of the humanities, which he often reminds us is a designation connoting much more than the sum total of those individual disciplines in literature, art, and related fields, for which the general, seemingly abstract rubric of humanities is often taken. In addition to merely consolidating traditional humanistic learning, he suggests, the task of the humanities lies in forging a culture of knowledge, a crossroads of views and beliefs, bringing in different worlds, inviting new constellations. Against this foil, themes such as mass incarceration, the concept of mercy or shame, urban health and economic issues, not traditionally studied and emphasized in humanistic studies, might come to the fore. Instead of defending the humanities, the effort thus should be that of extending their potential breadth. The Manhindra Humanities Center at Harvard has even experimented under his leadership with so-called news flash and short-term issues, my favorite being a prescient panel organized just one day after the election of Donald J. Trump and entitled Dark and Stormy. Who, after all, could have known at that moment that Stormy might just end up being our only in darkness? Homi Bhabha received several honorary doctorates from the Université de Paris, Wied, Saint-Denis, and the Free University of Berlin, among others. And he is an honorary member of the Zentrum für Literaturforschung, also in Berlin. And in this context, he was the recent recipient of the Alexander von Humboldt Research Grant, a lifetime achievement award, which often brings him back to Berlin in these days. In 2012, moreover, he was awarded India's National Padma Bhushan Prize for Literature and Education. Professor Bhabha is one of the rare thinkers whose writings have consistently influenced work undertaken in very different fields, such as architecture and management studies, development studies and human rights discourse, theology, and art. Several monographs have been contributed to the growing body of writing on his ongoing work, and 2 volumes of his own writing are currently underway, namely A Global Measure, forthcoming from Harvard University Press, and The Right to Narrate, forthcoming from Columbia University Press. His topic this afternoon is Statelessness and Death, Reflections on the Burdened Life. Please join me in welcoming Homi Bhabha.
That is quite massive. Good afternoon. It's indeed my honor and a great pleasure to be here I have spoken several times at Cornell, and each time with a real sense of engagement and purpose. I want to thank Professor Hen de Vries, who is now our leader at the School of Criticism and Theory, for his extraordinarily thoughtful and pointed introduction. This is, for me, really a sign of his leadership and the gravity that he brings to this extremely important program. I learned from it when I taught at Dartmouth, and I continue to meet people who have been inspired by the rigor of this of SCT. It's my great privilege to belong to the board, and I have an ongoing sense of the increased importance of the issues and the method of conversation and critique that happens here. I sort of regret the fact that nowadays the issues of theory seem to, in some places, fade. People see it as a kind of elite occupation, and in our own field, there seems to be a move towards more popular writing under the guise of communication and communicability. Of course, I very much support that. But the sort of rigor that SCT provides is really essential and insuperable. And each time I speak here, I feel committed, more committed to the commitment to theoretical and critical learning and teaching. Thank you very much for having me, giving me this honor, and thank you all for coming today. In a slightly lighter vein, and there are not many in my talk, I remember the time when I came a few years ago, and due to issues that are both funny and nerve-wracking, I arrived here by car from Cambridge, the driver of the car having been almost arrested half the way on my way to Cornell because he hadn't mentioned that he had had he'd had an event earlier which forbade him from driving in the state. And so we were sitting on the side of the road, and while we were trying to work this out, Jonathan was doing a faultless cabaret act and keeping the entire audience in place till I got here. So, Jonathan, thank you very much. It's also a great pleasure to have so many friends and supporters and inspirers in the audience. So, Hent has actually given you a sense, a very good location of my current work. And that relieves me of having to say more, although this is part of a larger manuscript on the kind of afterworld or the afterlife of migration in various fields, political, legal. You'll see some of the intersections between the legal and the philological here today. But then also the volume includes work that I've been doing on the humanities and the question of migration more generally, pedagogical work, and indeed the work not only in literature but also on contemporary artists. But let me begin today with two moments, two texts that have been very influential in my own thought. And taking my cue from Walter Benjamin, in the company of many Benjaminian scholars here, I want to introduce the issues that I will be dealing with by recalling Benjamin's idea that what history needs is to lose its epic vision and to import into its making the concept of montage. It's always intrigued me greatly, this idea of writing the history of emergence or the history of emergencies through montage. And I have a longer section of this in the book. But I'm going to actually make a little montage for you as I start my talk. Two texts from others. One, a report by a journalist who interviewed a distressed migrant called Nizam from Iraq. And I say distressed migrant because, you know, the classifications of asylum seekers, migrants, they are actually much more problematic and interconnected than they are. But the talk is really about distress migration, whether it's asylum seekers or refugees. I'm not denying the legal distinctions. I think those are very important, and I will talk some about that. But I just want to say the general phenomenological condition that I'm talking about is distress migration. And Nizam has this to say about himself. It is reported by these embedded journalists now, migration journalists who travel actually with groups of migrants and are very meticulous about their reportage. They continually, and this is punctilious and it's very good. They make distinctions between reported speech, and then their own comments. There's a whole ethics now of reporting, which I think is extremely important. This is from an excellent book written by the migration reporter of the Independent newspaper. In a paradoxical mixture of fearlessness and paranoia, anxiety about what's to come, but the simultaneous confidence that it's hardly worse than what's come before, Nizam is running through possible scenarios in his head, making a run for it, getting caught, having to try again. But he also remembers what he's running from in the first place: compulsory conscription, the advance of ISIS, the experience of wandering with no let-out clause through a wild and unknown continent starts to mirror that of the 1930s. And this is a text that somehow set the project for me. I wanted to understand the notion of risk, the responsibility of risk, conditionality, anxiety, the rapid movement between fearlessness and paranoia, anxiety and what's to come, and the moments in between. And I want to somehow to touch this area, to see it as part of a larger history of migration, and to find a way of actually talking in temporal terms, spatial terms, ethical terms, of this jagged juxtaposition of affect and purpose and decision. So that this text actually makes that point for me. And then when he says this starts to mirror the 1930s, I turn to a text written in a poem written in 1941, but effectively written about the 30s, and it's by W.H. Auden, and it's called Diaspora. So I've tried to compose a kind of historical narrative from Nizam to Auden. How he survived them, they could never understand. Had they not beggared him themselves to prove they could not live without the dogmas of their land, no worlds they drove him from were ever big enough How could it be the earth the unconfined meant when it bade them to set no limits to their love? And he fulfilled the role for which he was designed. On heat with fear he drew their terrors to him, and was a godsend to the lowest of mankind, till there was no place left where they could still pursue him, except that exile that they called his race. But envying him even that, they plunged right through him into a land of mirrors without time or space, and all they had to strike now was the human face. And I choose this because it pursues another idea, other than that jagged, affective, ethical, political world that I started with, which is what caught very well in a phrase by Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she says, those who were thought of as the scum of the earth in one place became the scum of the earth everywhere. And also the justification that tyrannies need to suggest that it is they who are being pursued, and the whole work of projection that goes on in that process, how he survived them, they could never understand. That's the other idea, this inversion of anger, this projection of paranoia from the position of the empowered. And these are little moments that I thought would bring together the mood of my talk today. The first section is called Barbaric Nationalism. Any curricular inquiry into the perilous life worlds of distressed migration must heed Hannah Arendt's warning delivered at the very end of The Origins of Totalitarianism. There is no outside to the global system. Whatever alienates global interdependence or annihilates cosmopolitan values must be seen to arise from the demonic dynamic of the expansion of the global condition itself. Deadly danger to any global civilization is no longer likely to come from without, Arendt writes. The danger is that a universally interrelated civilization may produce barbarians from its own midst by forcing millions of people into conditions which, despite all appearances, are the conditions of savages. In a telling footnote, often overlooked, Arendt addresses the fickle global promise of progress, what she calls the never-ending accumulation of capital and power, by turning to a question posed by an obscure bureaucratic functionary of the Indian civil service in the 1920s. What then, asks the global administrator, of those who are crushed by the triumphal car of progress? Arendt, in the footnote, both cites the question and responds with a quotation from none other than that celebrated post-colonial philosopher, Walter Benjamin. And then she quotes from her own translation from the manuscript as she puts it, and the quotation is familiar to us. She says, what we call progress is the wind that drives the angel of history irresistibly into the future, to which he turns his back while the pile of ruins before him towers to the sky. Progress and the pile of ruins, death and the pursuit of freedom, the human artifice and mere existence, human risk and human rights. These, dear friends, will be some of my preoccupations this afternoon. As barbarism stirs in the midst of our own interconnected civilization, the barbarians are no longer at the gates. Today, the barbarians police the gates, and their victims are, in the main, minorities, migrants, refugees. In the United States, and more recently in Italy, Steve Bannon has become the prime proponent of what I call a new barbarism. And this designation is not mine. It is his description of the political movement he propagates. In a recent interview in The Economist, Bannon proudly assumed the mantle of barbarism. Speaking of the 2017 US elections, this is how he described his ideological mission, and I quote him. "The country was thirsting for change, and Barack Obama didn't give them enough. I said, we are going for a nationalist message. We are going to go barbarian, and we will win." Discrimination and dishonor are two faces of barbaric nationalism. And I want to make a distinction, a passing distinction here between the language of discrimination and the language of dishonor. They are mobilized to denigrate minority populations, whether they are in flight or at home. The joint forces of discrimination and dishonor arrest the autonomy and dignity of individuals by attacking their very humanity as subjects of a civic comity. If discrimination is a sign of a deficit in the rights of citizenship, and Charles Taylor has recently been talking a lot about citizenship deficit in this moment. So if discrimination is a sign of a deficit in the rights of citizenship, this what I call dishonor rests on the denial of the rights of man. And it is their asymmetric imbrication, the perplexity of rights in Arendt's phrase, that becomes incendiary in the politics of barbaric nationalism. There is, however, I believe, a subtle but significant difference in the odious operations of the discourses of discrimination and dishonor. Discrimination tends to be institutional and systemic. It is often associated with a vacuum or violation of rights and representations. And this gives rise to the presumption that discrimination can normally be overcome by some form of legal repair or political remedy. Dishonor, however, is a different kind of language of social misprison and cultural misrecognition. Its representational medium is often visual, verbal, figurative, and imagistic. Its temporal medium is frequently informal and extra-institutional. Its object of vilification persistently embodied in psychoaffective states of being and time associated with race, gender, sexuality, criminality. Dishonor is protected by free speech and inadequately, in my view, regulated by hate speech legislation. You could say that the dishonored are suspended in a precarious liminal space between animality and humanity, between bestiality and civility. They always have that second nature attached to them that prevents them from being fully accepted as citizens. In fact, Du Bois called this partial citizenship. Discrimination, I believe, and I'm aware that this is a very brief summary of these ideas, which I've elaborated elsewhere, discrimination relies on a biopolitics of calculation and quantification to make its case for advocacy, quotas, data, statistics, numbers, and ratios. Dishonor is a biopolitics of affect, anxiety, fear, death, and destruction. You can imagine an end to discrimination, unlikely though it seems. There can, however, in my view, be no formal closure to the politics and the poetics of dishonor. And I think it's very important to recognize its huge rhetorical force and its rhetorical political effect. For all their brave talk, the lineup of inflated male leaders who dominate the world today, Putin, Trump, Erdogan, Modi, Duterte, Maduro, are not politicians of charisma. They are politicians of dishonor. They are not politicians of charisma. They are politicians of miasma. A fog of war emanates from their barbaric ethnic nationalisms as they rise in the guise of saviors to restore to the people a sense of their true blood and primordial belonging. Make America hate again. In the contempt they show for Democratic Party politics, each of these leaders projects himself as a pioneer of a mercurial movement politics, which is very different from a parliamentary politics. And these movements, barbaric as they are, resonate with the character of tribal nationalism as Arendt defines it in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Let me quote, "Politically speaking, tribal nationalism always insists that its own people is surrounded by a world of enemies, one against all, that a fundamental difference exists between this people and all others. It claims its people to be unique, individual, incompatible with others, and denies theoretically the very possibility of a common mankind long before it is used to destroy the humanity of man." And in fact, the iconic presence of these tribal nationalist leaders, the index you can see in this text itself. Modi, for instance, like Trump, one against all. In fact, I call this crew the 64.5-inch chest group of leaders, because Modi always says, I have a 64-inch chest. I will struggle for the people of this country even when the elites attack me, because I have a 64-inch chest. Now, I think that in Trump's case, one might have to construct something to do with the coiffeur, but you get the idea. My talk today revisits these trials of barbarism with a humanist attention to the philology and phenomenology of the migration crisis. How to read a situation in which the very act of hope and survival is a close encounter with figures of death, loss, fear, risk, vulnerability, natality, and fatality, as close as they can get. Death in this figurative or tropic sense can be an ethic of ironic tenacity, of resistance, and of choice too, in the face of injury and injustice. Levinas, alluding to what he calls the death-life metaphor, suggests, and I quote, that it is in being answerable for the neighbor's life that we are already with the other in death. The side-by-side proximity of death and life, or what I called a moment ago, natality, fatality, repeats in the everyday emergencies of our present history, migration, climate change, and racial shootings, and indeed targeted terror. And in each of these cases, it severely tests the method and mettle of our critical thinking. I actually have another chapter where I look at these different schools of thought and how they think the future through death, whether it's climate change or indeed, as I'm going to argue, migration. I'm trying to evoke, in a literary spirit, conceptual and theoretical problems related to the despair and repair of migration. The first section is situated around the rubbish dumps of Zazas in Tunisia. My second scenario plays out in a caste-ridden village in a district of Maharashtra in India. The former is a real-life, real-time event. The latter carries the bare truth of fiction. Both, in their different ways, are spaces haunted by the death-life metaphor that afflicts what Arendt has called, and I quote her, oppressed history-suffering groups who are fated to survive in what elsewhere she calls the barbed wire labyrinth of degrees of statelessness, partial citizens at best, outcasts in many cases. The rubbish dumps of Zazas. Zazas, a coastal town in southeastern Tunisia, is known for its thriving fishing industry and its prodigious oil production. Zazas, in the last decade, has also become a beachhead for beleaguered migrants and refugees from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Syrians, Eritreans, Libyans, Ethiopians, Bangladeshis, and Afghanis head for Zazas in their attempts to reach Tunisia's long Mediterranean coast. Most of the people who have washed up in Lampedusa or other such places in recent years, writes Charlotte Gibsons, the Independent's migration correspondent, and I quote her, were there because of causes they were prepared to die for. Syrians who would die to defeat Bashar al-Assad, mothers who would die to protect their children. They did not want to die for Europe, but Europe forced them to take that risk. Death's dominion waits for no one. The stench of decaying foreign bodies hangs heavy in the air, and the citizens of Zazas create a cordon sanitaire around the polluting presence of migrants and refugees in order to protect the protesting citizens of Zazas. Fisherfolk refuse to cast their nets in waters they believe to be polluted. The people of Zazas refuse to admit foreign corpses into local morgues because their very existence defiles the sanctity of the dead belonging to local families. Underfunded municipal authorities, unqualified for the task, dump dead bodies outside the town limits. A sense of fear and revulsion surrounds the whole process, a local journalist observes. If they're brought to the hospital, the smell and fear of disease angers local citizens. The smell and fear. They do not want the bodies buried in the town's cemeteries. The cemeteries for refugees in Zazas, as I said a moment ago, are open mounds of earth piled high with garbage. They're indeed the town's garbage dumps. Steve St. Amour, a deep-water search and recovery expert in Zazas, draws the unforgiving conclusion. You would have thought that he had been reading Hannah Arendt, by the way. He says, you only have stateless people. Which country has a national interest to find out what happened to them? Rightless people, expelled from the human condition, are thrown back into the peculiar state of nature, you will recall Hannah Arendt saying, and the dead in Zazas, we might say, are cast out on the rubbish dumps. At a rough count, there have been 22,500 deaths by water since 2014, and the number is rising. Mohamed Trabelsi of the Tunisian Red Crescent will not give in to St. Amour's anxious resignation. The harsh sentence of statelessness delivered on the migrant dead by the nation's neglect cannot be allowed to have the last word, according to Trabelsi. Outraged by the treatment of corpses as forms of detritus, Trabelsi speaks metaphorically of the dead as though they are still alive, deserving not only of proper burial rites, but indeed of the dignity of human rights. For me, he says, these corpses are people who have human rights. They should be treated with respect. After all, we never know how our lives can change at some point in the future, and we can become those people. Trabelsi's claims for the rights and respect for refugee deaths exceeds, I believe, the moral intuitionism that underscores the concept of universal human values enacted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Moral intuitionism, the grounds of dignity in the discourse of human rights, proposes that people, and I quote, everywhere have a moral sense or faculty that gives them unaided access to basic truths of morality. Moral intuitionism often results, I believe, in a benevolent universalism or equivalence. They are human beings just like ourselves, and there, but for the grace of God, go I. I construe Trabelsi's statement as potentially saying something more radical that departs from the intuitionist claim to an unaided access to basic truths of morality. Trabelsi's claim that human rights are figuratively embodied in corpses is open to a different reading, something like this. I just want to mention that in the drafting of the Universal Declaration, after many sessions, they decided to go with this moral intuitionism for a historical reason. And the reason was that they didn't want people to say, oh, we never realized. that historical moment was different, and there were different sets of relativistic factors. It was actually written for that purpose, but I do believe that despite the good intentions of that, dignity, the concept of dignity, which is indeed founded or grounded in moral intuitionism, has really created an ethical problem. So let me tell you what I think that Trabelsi's statement, and I'm particularly going to talk about this part of it. So counterfactually, these people have rights now. They should be treated with respect, and I've said it's not the respect due to dead bodies. It's not burial rights he's talking about. After all, we never know how our lives can change at some point in the future, and we can become these people. And that's what I'm going to talk about for a moment. At some point in the unknowable future, our rights to citizenship may or may not become so worthless and compromised so as to render us unprotected, vulnerable, and homeless, minorities in our own homelands, or refugees adrift in someone else's. There is simply no knowing, because the future to which Trabelsi appeals, in my view, is not the moral intuitionist kind of universalism. But he appeals but the future to which he appeals in making his moral and political pitch is less probabilistic and more proleptic. It is, as such, a prefiguring or foreshadowing of a future that has not as yet come, but that leaves its marks in a narrative within the present time of enunciation, or the narration of an event at a point earlier than its chronological place in a story or in time. And this is a slight variation of the OED description of the proleptic, and I thought I would give it to you in this way. The radical unknowability of place, time, and person, indeed its out-of-placeness and its out-of-temporal sequence, compels our ethical and political commitment now and at this point, based on the unknowability. Our commitments are principled precisely because they're non-contractual, non-instrumental, anachronistic, and even asymmetrical. Moral practices and political principles that pivot on the proleptic of what I'm calling this future conditional and its figurative language do not neglect long-standing social injustices. They only intensify their necessity and veracity in the present. They bring them back as a now, the now of recognizability, the now of accessibility. It is with Levinas in mind that I allow myself to think in this direction. In a stirring sentence that it could have been spoken side by side with Trabelsi amidst the rubbish dumps of Zazas, Levinas says, men may ethically seek one another in the incondition or the unconditionality of strangers. The lives of strangers as neighbors, he continues, are claimants, and I quote him, to the defense of the rights of man which correspond to a vocation outside the state, a kind of extraterritoriality within political society that upholds justice in its limitations. Extraterritoriality within the politics of the state. So this is an imbrication of the rights of man, the rights of citizens, territoriality, extraterritoriality, which is very different from Arendt, although close to her, because of course for her the rights of man and the rights of citizens, although they're imbricated, lose their power. When the one loses, the other loses. This is also a different position, I think, from Agamben, and I'm happy to discuss this. But I think this notion of the extraterritorial within a political, kind of a third space within political society, which is an imbrication of the perplexity of rights. You know, when Arendt talks about the perplexity of rights, what is so interesting is that she says the fact is that in these conditions of emergency, people don't know what rights they have and what rights they don't have. And that's the condition of death life that we've got to deal with. It's this unknowability that I was talking about a moment ago. The lives of strangers as neighbors, as I said, are claimants to the defense of the rights of man which correspond to a vocation outside the state, a kind of extraterritoriality within a political society that upholds justice in its limitations, or we might say, the law at its wits' ends. A condition of statelessness bordering on, approximating to, abutting within citizenship. And if Levinas's concept of extraterritoriality as an ethical jurisdiction sounds abstruse to you, let me relate it to a current legal condition, very much at the heart of the jurisprudence of migration. If we fail to uphold justice at its limits, justice precisely in its liminal moments in ethical and legal matters relating to minorities and migrants, we collude in the creation of what lawyers call legal black holes. The phrase comes from the legal philosopher Itamar Mann. In that case, he argues, and I quote, whether pushed to sea by the increasingly violent conditions in Syria, Libya, Burma, Eritrea, or Iraq, or pulled by the hope of being saved, the operation sees a continuous swell in migrant departures and continuous deaths at sea. States then seek to leave migrants beyond the scope of their legal duties under constitutional and or international law. This is, of course, one of the main issues here, both in terms of the ethical jurisprudence and also the jurisdictional issue. And we can also discuss, if you like, the same kind of tension between jurisdiction and jurisprudence which exists in Article 51 of the Refugee Convention, which we can go into later. But what I'm interested in is this ethical or metaphysical notion of the extraterritorial, pushing law to its limits within political society as being both the nest of the rights of man, therefore not ineffective, as Arendt argues, once the rights of citizenship are gone, the rights of man go too. No, it's a greater tension here. And its links with these extraterritorialities in the law itself, in these actual spaces of death and survival. The death-life metaphor has become a leitmotif of the migration crisis in both fact and fiction. Geith, a Syrian refugee seeking asylum in Sweden, bears personal witness to the ghostly agency of distressed migration, the act of hoping against hope, life against life. Right now, he says, Syrians consider themselves already dead. Maybe not physically, but psychologically and socially. If the chance of making it to Europe across the Mediterranean is even 1%, then that means that there is a 1% chance of your leading an actual life. Refugees and distressed migrants from a host of African countries, Libya, Ghana, Nigeria, dwell in a melancholic state of unemployed anomie and psychic apathy, a kind of death life in Jenny Erpenbeck's migration masterwork, Go, Went, Gone. In silent protest, they camp outside Berlin's town hall, making their erased presence visible with a written sign that says, "We become visible." Erpenbeck's characters are unsuspecting victims of the Dublin Agreement. The Dublin Agreement, in the view of Goodwin Gill, the leading authority on the Refugee Convention and distressed migration, regards individual interests, as he puts it, in an almost dehumanizing approach to the asylum seeker as object, not subject, as therefore disentitled from any right to express a preference, let alone choose his or her destination, as objects, not subjects, something before, to be taken back or to be taken in charge. And this is the Dublin Agreement about where you land and, in fact, what rights you have at the place where you are, and how your own choice of where you might want to go is severely limited to where you actually, where you hit landfall. So having talked from Geith and his testimony of the already dead, I want to bring you from testimony to fiction. And I think there is this remarkable passage in Erpenbeck's book which really reflects the whole the Dublin Agreement. Is very much part of the text itself. And of such lives where the saved continue to live out the burden of the drowned, Erpenbeck writes, these days the differences between the refugees who drown somewhere between Africa and Europe and those who don't is just a matter of happenstance. In this sense, every one of the African refugees here is simultaneously alive and dead. Such a matter of happenstance, being simultaneously alive and dead, is an ontological condition with, as I've explained, a jurisdictional history. Once migrants fall into the legal black holes of the migration crisis, killing typically occurs, as lawyers say, while all involved actors express their dismay, their shame, and indeed their horror, but can avoid extending their help. The trope of the living dead has developed an ontological authority across diverse discourses. As I have shown, testimony, fiction, law, journalism, but its ubiquity must not be allowed to homogenize the vastly different trajectories and contexts in which the death-life metaphor arrests and agitates the anxious imagination of risk and survival. However, in each of these invocations of death-life as I have laid them out before you, there sounds a common cri de coeur. In their singular ways, speaking of different causes and from disparate conditions, each of these voices bears witness to a barbarous condition defined as the crime of transnational barbarism in the 1930s by the great Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin, who would go on to draft the Genocide Convention in 1948. In his autobiography, Lemkin describes the refugee as, first of all, a state of mind, a broken pencil, a ghost, their permanent impermanence, the suspension of their values and hopes gradually ravage the souls and reduce them to this ghost-like, deathly experience. Acts of barbarity cause humiliation and dishonor, which when taken together, Lemkin argues very presciently, bring harm not only to human rights, but also and most especially undermine the fundamental basis of a just social order. With the prescience relevant to ethnic cleansing, racial violence, cultural destruction, Lemkin defines barbarity as a process of transnational contagion directed against collectivities, and I quote him, similar to epidemics, they can pass from one country to another. Indeed, acts of barbarity often cause the emigration or the disorganized flight of the population of one state to another. A resonance with our own times which is so remarkable. And his autobiography is really, it's a small publication, but really worth reading. And those of you who are interested in both the history and the biography almost of the Genocide Convention, or should read Philippe Sand's great book, East-West Street, which I consider to be one of the finest biographies of ideas. How little they know, those now complicit in the loss of life, is Goodwin Gill's dark rebuke to the rational choice principles of policy thinking on deterrence and its violation of the rights of migrant protection. How little the policy pundits know, because they refuse to look. Figurative discourse, tropic discourse, the concept of life, death, the metaphor and the metaphysics and the ontology reveals, I believe, a structure of disavowal that afflicts the rationale of policy praxis that resorts to physical barriers, building walls, sealing borders, policing frontiers, because its prosaic proceduralism screens out the imminent flux of desire and affect, of death and life, normalized in the everyday intersubjective endurance of the end-of-life decisions and dilemmas that are faced even by those who survive. Goodwin Gill gets to the heart of the matter in his essay, The Mediterranean Papers, which lays out the rights and responsibilities that must be vigilantly protected in principle and procedure to avoid the killing wave of the migration, whether it's in the Mediterranean or indeed the waves of migration over land and desert. And actually, I think that when Goodwin Gill speaks, he brings to his great knowledge of the whole history and the drafting of the Refugee Convention a rare kind of fleeting phenomenological ethical glimmer, and that's where I've actually pulled out my argument in relation to his work. Let me quote from the Mediterranean Papers. Whether we are thinking about sealing borders or of the many current lesser policies and practices favored by governments today, what we see time and time again is how they fail entirely to understand what it is that drives people, knowingly and rationally, to risk their own lives and their families' lives, how little they know those now complicit in the loss of life. Only when knowledge and understanding of the despair of others, of their need to survive, and of their persistent optimism, only when these factors are integrated into serious long-term policy thinking, not policy thinking to immediately deal with a crisis, will we begin to see programs with a chance of making a positive impact, of providing proactively and not reactively humanitarian alternatives to the present crisis on the doorstep of Europe. In spite of its formal espousal of community goals and community values, the European Union remains a congeries of dislocated, dysfunctional sovereign states unable to contemplate working together on what is perceived perhaps as a difficult issue touching sovereignty, security, and of course, the other. And of course, the other. Now, let me just say that middle paragraph, knowledge and understanding of the despair of others to survive, optimism, death, it's the same mix of issues that he's calling for to be embodied in policy that Nizam represented in the first quotation I wrote. How can this material be brought into policy thinking? Into policy thinking that departs from sovereignty, security. And then he says, and of course the other. And of course the other. Goodwin Gill repeatedly invokes the other as a critical measure, part ethical, part existential, never sentimental, to reveal the inequities and inadequacies of rational choice migration policy. His recourse to otherness is not merely empathetic or a humanistic gesture. It is, I believe, an underdeveloped but heuristic act aimed at opening up new horizons of hospitality and rights. To integrate the despair of others into the long-term policy thinking, Goodwin Gill shifts the agency of address from sovereignty and security of the state to the survival and risk of the migration experience. Not simply as an add-on, but the question I'm posing is, what would it be if you took that, not sovereignty and security, but the notion of the unprotected, as the enunciative site, the first principle of drafting a proactive rather than a reactive body of knowledge around the migration movement. The migrant as object, as something somewhere, is reinterpolated as a subject with actionable claims that emerge from within the dislocations or the interstices opened up by the dysfunctional jurisdictions of states and the European community. So in a way, I think he's suggesting a way of thinking about policy interstitially. He said, think of it in the dysfunctional moments of what happens. Don't always refer it back to the stable institutions which will then generate a jurisprudential version which will again write about sovereignty primarily and the unprotected only as a way of solving a problem of that. Reverse the order of enunciation, reverse the notion of interpellation. In order to resist the hegemonic jurisdictional authority of sovereignty and security, the Mediterranean Papers enable us to conceive of the enunciative site of policy discourse from within legal black holes, occupying ethical spaces of extraterritoriality, as Levinas puts it, in the midst of political society. And I think the larger question here really is, what is the status of affect in the construction of policy? What is the knowledge of affect in the construction of policy? How can we turn that into a discourse? I'm talking about it as death life because I see this thing emerging again and again and again. And I felt I could not simply use it as a metaphorical expression of something, but it is an enunciative site. It is the place from which people are making a sense of their lives, from which they're making decisions. And it seems a defeating idea as to how this can be brought into policy discourse, something that we could discuss later on. Because if you read the 9/11 report, all 10,000 pages of it, the one affect that is actually referred to again and again is that somehow, somewhere, humiliation has something to do with the desire for terror. And yet, it is merely descriptive, or it is psychologized. It's a reductive notion. What humiliation may mean as a political passion, to even acknowledge that somehow seems to be going in the wrong direction. So the problem is never actually situated. The problem never becomes the place from which the policy emerges. If you read the work on security, on the lack of security, the basic norm is that we occupy the place of security to talk about insecurity. I'm suggesting that what happens through the tropic uses, through these metaphors, these figurative languages, is that people are constructing something else, something different. Novelists, journalists, they're actually occupying that space, that ontological space, to make a different outcome around thinking about these problems. But how to integrate that affective, psychic, intersubjective realm within policy discourse, which generally has a rational choice, bottom line approach to solve a problem, is indeed, I think, a recurrent issue. And it is one of my hopes at the Humanities Center at Harvard to edge closer to how to think about this. This is why we are now part of a three-year Mellon-funded project on migration in the humanities, precisely to change the terms in which the rationality of policy thinking works. In order to resist the hegemonic jurisdictional authority of sovereignty and security, the Mediterranean Papers enable us to conceive of the originating enunciative impulse of policy from within legal black holes occupying the ethical spaces of extraterritoriality. In a process resembling what we might call a dialectics of negation, the place of unprotection, the ironic, desperate rationality of what it means to risk death for life, becomes then the pivotal framework, ethical and political, of a non-rational choice policy that must engage primarily, as Goodwin Gill insists, with elements of risk assessment, personal networks, language and ability, culture, employment opportunities, an assessment of the chances of acceptance. Now think, if the concept of the migrant or the refugee or the migrant in distress were to be constituted out of these different issues, elements of risk assessment, personal networks, language ability, cultural employment, you would have a completely different subject to which you were addressing the problem. The whole subject of what it would mean to be politically or phenomenologically, the space that the refugee would occupy ethically would change completely. It would be a very different kind of being that we were talking about, both ethically, epistemologically, and indeed enunciatively. To integrate the elements of the desperation and yet the defiance of the other into le sujet d'énonciation of migration discourse is to privilege risk not as the last act of despair, but as the originating impulse of political and ethical deliberations on refugee security and migrant populations. And indeed, this is one of the issues we realize. We live in a society of profound, deep surveillance, and the individuals in our society have never been more at risk than before. The disadvantaged individuals, minorities, have never, in this country, even if this is the whole Black Lives Matter issue, have been as much at risk. We have surveillance, we have security apparatuses, but we don't have safety. And I think this was a point made a long time ago in The Far Next Time by James Baldwin, that security is not safety. To integrate these elements into le sujet d'énonciation is to privilege risk, to write migration policy from the place of unprotection, as I'm calling it, or the place of dishonor and not the quasi-legal discourse of discrimination, immediately reveals the risky foundations of a fundamental principle in the Universal Declaration of Rights, which is the right to movement. Article 13 of the UDHR, which deals with the right to movement, national and international, which is the issue we are talking about today when we talk about migration crisis, was always considered to be minoritarian in intent. Quote, to prevent discrimination on grounds of race, color, where people might live and how they might move from place to place. So this fundamental idea of liberty, the right to movement, I just want to remind you, in the drafting of the Universal Declaration, it was seen primarily to be about migratory movement, the movement of discriminated peoples. As Lemkin puts it, the transnational barbarism. That was what its focus was. It was not simply a kind of universal notion of the right to movement. However, there has remained a serious worry about migrants being at risk, unprotected, as they exercise the international right to move between countries. To speak from this place of risk, as do Saint-Amour, Trabelsi, Gaith, and each of Eppenbeck's characters, in their attempts to exercise their right of movement involved in seeking refugee and asylum, is to reveal a structural vulnerability in the very drafting of the Universal Declaration, which is everywhere visible. That vulnerability is everywhere visible in our own anguished times. A policy intervention based on the protection of the other's risk rather than the privilege of state security resonates with the African-American subaltern strategy of what Baldwin calls the negative way. It is an ontological mode of political resistance to the stranglehold of discrimination and dishonor, taking a death-life risk in the cause of rights and dignity, and nobody calls it better than James Baldwin. We achieve our nation and our community as citizens, Baldwin argues, when we fully realize that the price for transformation is social and psychic risk, no matter what. Transformation by way of an identification with the risk of alterity, beginning with the life-death of distressed migration, is to understand what it is that drives people knowingly and rationally to risk their own lives and their families' lives for a 1% chance of an actual life. To change, then, the subject of policy deliberations from sovereignty and security to survival and risk is to mobilize risk in order to pay the price of transformation. And the price of the ticket, as Baldwin would call it, for this kind of extraterritorial thinking within political society can have real-time results. consider the 2012 landmark judgment of the European Court of Human Rights in the case of Hirsi Jamal et al. Versus Italy on the pushback operations of the Italian state. Goodwill Gill, by the way, considers this to be a watershed moment in the protection of the human rights of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers globally. The implications are beyond the European courts. In May 2009, Italian Coast Guard vessels intercepted the boats of Somali and Eritrean nationals who were attempting to reach Europe. 35 nautical miles south of Lampedusa, the distressed migrants were hauled onto Italian vessels, taken back to Libya, their embarkation point. Once in Libya, they were handed over to the Libyan authorities. The American Society of International Law reports the European Court's findings as follows. The Court's findings on collective expulsion reinforce those relating to non-refoulement. Non-refoulement is, you know, the principle that you can't send somebody back to a place where they are in danger. You cannot do that. That violates their rights. While the principle of non-refoulement imposes primarily an obligation of result requiring that people are not transferred to places where their lives and freedoms are at risk, the prohibition of collective expulsion under international law imposes a duty of due process in that it requires an examination of each applicant's individual situation. Pushback operations without such individualized assessment are therefore generally illegal. With the Hirsi judgment, the European Court continues to strengthen what the Court calls the extraterritorial protection offered by the European Convention for effect across the world. Now, you can see how I've been playing with this notion of extraterritoriality as an ethical jurisdiction, extraterritoriality as a death-life situation, extraterritoriality now in a more positive sense, extraterritoriality as a due process, a problem against collective expulsion. So I just want to say that, you know, I've been playing with this concept or changing it and transferring it from its very denigratory, dishonorable moments to moments of its kind of chiasmatic reversal. And I want, therefore, I said that there is both repair and there is harm. There is repair and harm at the same time, which is, of course, what the death-life motif really talks about. The jurisprudential reasoning of the Hirsi judgment connects in many respects with my argument. In strengthening extraterritorial protection, the Court's findings reveal the black holes of the law, and the judgment's ethical and enunciative stance engages primarily with the apparatus of risk assessment. All of a sudden now in the Hirsi judgment, what I was talking about, the unprotected, the risk becomes the center of the issue ethically as well as legally. It is no longer security of the state or the sovereignty of the nations. The Court's extension of extraterritorial protection beyond the European Union resonates in striking ways with my reading of Levinas's extensions of ethical extraterritoriality in defense of the rights of man, which correspond, as he puts it, to a vocation outside the state that engages and has to engage in these moments with justice in its limitations, justice at its limits. The risks taken by those who are now corpses strewed on the rubbish dumps of Zazas, or Eppenbeck's African migrants who are simultaneously alive and dead because they took the 1% risk, hold the rest of us to the high moral standard of ethically seeking one another in the unconditionality, or indeed, as I've argued, the future conditionality of strangers, because, as Trabelsi said at the outset of my talk, these corpses are people who have human rights, and we will never know at what time in the future we may become these people. Now, I have this ends quite nicely. I have a coda which actually talks about the untouchables and refugees, a short coda of 4 pages. Is it the will of the people that I read it? Or should I stop? I'm quite happy to stop here. I mean, I think I've sort of brought the aeroplane home. But should I just finish it? Okay. And it is from this risk-laden liminal space of law and ethics that I want to turn to another instance of death life in an Indian village in Maharashtra. Here, risk reveals the untouchable citizen to be, ironically, the refugee at home. Santu, our protagonist, picks up Baldwin's wager and takes the social and psychic risk no matter what. And you know, the idea that this kind of social and psychic risk, the reason I say that policy should be turned around and written around risk rather than sovereign security, because this is the condition of most in the world. This is the framework within which people are making their choices, their life choices, their personal choices. Conclusion, outside the fold. Santu, a Dalit untouchable who lives in a village in Maharashtra, has a problem with his worn, wet chappals. Chappals is the word for sandals or slippers. His feet keep slipping out of the slimy leather thongs and threaten to give away. The road is treacherous and it is hard to get a firm foothold. As Santu makes his way, losing his balance repeatedly, tripping and falling, he finds it difficult to pursue any kind of path whatsoever, or indeed to get a toehold in the slippery society in which he lives. It feels as if the very ground on which he stands is, he says, trying to trip him up, and the earth itself wants to throw him off his back. Think back again of the Arendtian notion of the stateless being thrown back into the state of nature, or indeed of the fish, of the bodies being thrown back into the Mediterranean. Santu's sense of himself is dark and dead. Like Gaith, the Syrian refugee who mentioned that he was part of the already dead, a free thought and free movement is extinguished. Was it not a feat of trying to keep his balance, he thinks, standing in the mire of slimy customs? The tenuous fold of casteism would hem in his mind, but it would still struggle to break out. He slipped on a rock in the path, and his wet chappal snapped. Cursing, he walked on barefoot. My name is itself a curse. And again, refugees, as you know, when you read their testimonies, say, this word refugee is itself a curse, even though it is an opportunity. Refugee, a short story by the celebrated Marathi untouchable writer Avinash Dolas, is set in a Mahar village, similar to what Ambedkar calls Ambedkar, the great Indian thinker, writer, the leader of the untouchables, and also the chairperson of the committee that drafted the Indian Constitution, a real minoritarian thinker of the Constitution. What Ambedkar calls the Indian ghetto, the black hole of the Republic. Ambedkar, the untouchable intellectual who chaired the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution, had this to say: the Republic is an empire of the Hindus over untouchables. It is a kind of colonialism of the Hindus designed to exploit the untouchables. The untouchables have no rights. They're there only to wait, serve, and submit. They're there to do and to die. They have no rights because they're outside the village republic, and because they're outside the so-called republic, they're outside the Hindu fold. This is a vicious circle, but this is a fact which cannot be gainsaid. Just remember now how much in the writings of Gandhi, in the anti-colonial nationalist writings, the village is glorified. The village is supposed to be the thing with which you beat back the notion of the imperial city. The village is at the heart of Indian experience. A highly romanticized utopian view by Gandhi, which did no, which really provided no help for those untouchables who were literally made to live outside the village most often, while they did all the scavenging works for the Hindu villages themselves. You can see the analogy of the corpses outside Zazas and the untouchables like Santu outside the village. Santu's imago of his own person is assembled from prosthetic parts, dead limbs, or what he calls his dog-like life. Like a piece of iron sought by someone for no particular purpose, heated, hammered, pounded flat at will, that's what he was. Iron at first inflamed, and then enduring blow after blow of the hammer, till finally, one day, it snapped. As Dolas cleverly uses body parts to signify the biopolitics of untouchability, Santu's sense of himself as an agent of liberty and even liberation is pitted against what Antonio Gramsci once described as the tidal wave of hegemonic power that renders subaltern agency chaotic, formless, and extempore, even in its moment of resistance. Santu's precarious, waterlogged choppers, losing their balance in the slimy grounds of the segregated village, create a destiny that is in part chaotic, formless, and extempore. He externalizes the somatic dialectics of the caste system as it passes through the body in violent amputations and displacement, the untouchable as dog or a piece of molten iron. Ambedkar is only too aware of the role played by the political unconscious in the unmaking of untouchable citizenship. To tell an untouchable, you are free, you are a citizen, you have all the rights of a citizen, and then to tighten the rope in such a way as to leave him no opportunity to realize it is a cruel deception. It is enslavement without making the untouchables conscious of their enslavement. It is slavery, though it is untouchability. It is real, though it is indirect. It is enduring because it is unconscious. Dolas's depiction of the untouchable body, of the broken man, in Ambedkar's phrase, exposes the empty ideal of citizenship held out to the half-fledged citizen who is impeded at every step in every mode of speech and action. Dolas passionately paints the picture. Was it not a feat of trying to keep his balance, standing in the mire of slimy customs? Directionless in his dilemma, north, south, east, west, all seem equally discriminatory and dishonorable. Santu decides to flee like a refugee, as he puts it, to Bombay, and it is on the train to Bombay, when Santu meets Surji, a refugee from Bangladesh, that he enters the temple realm of ethical alterity, as I have defined it in a reading of Trabelsi's proleptic plea. After all, we will never know at what point our lives can change and we can become these other people. The perplexity of rights, the citizen come untouchable, are revealed through a glass darkly, and Dolas reveals Santu's paradoxical status as citizen refugee. And I quote, Bangladesh, massacre, refugees. A whole series of scenes pass before his eyes. A man leaves Bangladesh to see his relations in Bombay as a refugee. And here I am, a citizen of this country. I argued, I protested for my rights, but my mother herself finally told me to go. My son, go away from here, it's too much trouble. The whole scene came alive again before his eyes. On one side, there was a Bangladesh in turmoil, and on the other, the community of Mahars in agony. One homeless Bangladeshi refugee was going back to his relatives after 20 years. And one Mahar, even after 20 years, was homeless in his own country. It is when the chappals break, he throws them off, and he begins to stand somewhat on his own feet. I've attempted to devise this afternoon a way of understanding rights and respect that begin with the risk of death life, maybe not physical but psychological and social. We are already dead, as Guy puts it, in marked contrast to the norm of dignity in the Universal Declaration, which is founded on the moral intuitionism of the concept of birth, both physical and ethical. As Johannes Morsing puts it in his great study of the Universal Declaration, the word born carries the moral weight of the inherence view of human rights and Enlightenment inheritance, and was unanimously adopted by all 4 drafting committees as meaning in the words of Grumbach of France, that the right to freedom and equality was inherent from the moment of birth. There are two moments of birth in the Universal Declaration. One is that you have dignity because you are born into the human family. The second is this unmediated moral intuition. As soon as you are born, you have this moral intuitionism. And now I hope you realize why I started with death and death life as part of this lecture today. For Ambedkar, dignity is a difficult word, often carrying a negative caste connotation. Dignity is the norm for the protection and preservation of caste privilege. Dignity destroys the self-respect of the untouchable community of the colonized citizen in Ambedkar's usage. Despite its negative imprint, however, Ambedkar didn't give up on dignity, in my view. Dignity for him, or the attack on dishonor, as for Arendt, was emphatically not what you were born with. That is the concept of Arendt's, the right to have rights, which is completely a non-foundational statement. So dignity, despite its negative imprint, is for Ambedkar, as for Arendt, emphatically not what you were born with. Dignity is how you learn to bear the burden of disrespect and dehumanization and still have the confidence and the courage to take that 1% chance to survive in the Mediterranean, or to run across the undergrowth, to enter a barbed wire labyrinth, to cross a frontier in Europe, or to throw away your chappals, your slippers, in the slime of a caste-ridden Mahar village and walk barefoot the last mile for the first time. Dignity in extremis, risk as redemption. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Homi. There's ample time for questions, observations. Please stand up when you speak so that we can all hear you, and perhaps also mention your name.
Thank you for your question. And something that returns recurrently in your presentation is the idea that these corpses are people who have rights in their own, and we don't know if in the future we will become these corpses. And this is a major idea that returns often, I would say, more argument that is presented to us. But is there also the possibility that these corpses are people who have rights in their own independently by the fact that we might become these corpses? So my question is, should we really place ourselves in our as autonomous existence now as a terms of reference to understand this tragedy, or this tragedy can be understood also in more universal terms, independently by us?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question, but let me see if I can answer it. My purpose was that it is a relational situation. It is not that we will actually become these people. That's why the talk is very much about the intelligence of tropes, if you like, or the non-rational intelligence of tropes. I think the challenging argument is not the moral intuitionist argument, there but for the grace of God go I. You know, this is such a terrible tragedy. You know, we've got to think in universal terms that any of us could be in that position, and that's why we've got to feel or do for this issue. That, I think, is less ethically challenging because it is based on a kind of empathy, and I don't think empathy is a bad word. I keep having to defend myself on this. But I think it is based, as I have shown right through the talk, that in the legal apparatus you can have all this feeling, oh my God, how terrible it is, I could be in that, and nations will do nothing. Or individuals will do nothing. That's why I'm suggesting what I call this future conditional. It is because I may not be in that position, because I am not in that position, that's where really the ethical challenge of the unconditional, of the stranger lies. Not because I know it or I may know it. That's why I say it's not probabilistic, it's proleptic. That's where the ethical issue lies. Therefore, I use this notion of extraterritoriality in a legal sense, in an ethical sense, and actually in a almost physical sense, by talking both about the slime and the slippers on the one, the chappals, which don't give you any traction, and you cannot be an upstanding citizen. You cannot have citizenly standing on the one hand, and on the other hand, the slime on the one hand and the garbage dumps on the other. That was the kind of design of the essay, of the lecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bhabha. That was amazing. I'm kind of trying to think, jumping off of the last question, I'm trying to think in between the idea of refugee and homelessness and hostliness, which is connected with it, and the idea of liminality or extraterritoriality, which are kind of in a weird way kind of connected.
Yeah.
There has been like a general criticism of your work, the materialist, kind of been talking about the fact that the languages being given too much power, that discourses is being given too much power over matter. So I'm not talking about that. I'm trying to kind of understand this question from a geographer's perspective.
From a geographical perspective, you say?
I go to school for geography, so from a geographic perspective, what kind of epistemic advantage this idea of extraterritoriality brings to your discourse?
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me just answer the first question. Why is language and discourse not material? I've never quite understood this. And here in this talk in particular, I talk about a whole range of things. I talk about journalism, right, which is how we really most often learn about these events and develop form our opinions, which are deeply material, both to us and to the community. I talk about the law. And I talk not only about the language of the law in a kind of law in literature way, but I talk about the very ways in which the law creates its own ethical objects and subjects. So I talk about that. Now, I'm just trying to say that I'm giving you these examples so that I've never understood why there is this embarrassment about philology and the use and the understanding of language, whereas in fact, in this country as in many others, people read legal opinions the whole time, which are products of interpretation, they're products of precedent, they're products of splitting hairs, they're products of testimony. So I think that cultural philology, if I might put it that way, the interest in language, the interest in image, the interest in the sound world of music, these are as material forms of social thinking and the social constitution as anything else. So that's my point. And, sorry, do you want me to answer your second question?
I just wanted to kind of elaborate a little further. So thinking about, for example, your idea of refugee as a site of enunciation of rights, let's say,
yes,
as a kind of taking static subject as a site of enunciation.
What subject?
Static subject as a site of enunciation of right that the general barbaric nationalism takes. So I'm trying to kind of think the trope, the movement of extraterritoriality that you talk about as proleptic future that comes from the future comes back. what is, again, it's like, what is this epistemic advantage, this discursive advantage that allows you to kind of deterritorialize yourself and think about an ethical future and then bring it back and then, of course, instantiate on the sides. Instead of like thinking, you know, what is the loss if we think about the encounter as everyday?
If you go on, my dear friend, I really won't be able to answer this question because I can't get the drift of it. So if you want to kind of just summarize what the issue is in a sentence, then I'll be able to answer you.
I'm just saying that your idea brings the future back, so instead of imagining a present into the future, what do you think is?
Well, you know, I think that that was the point of my paper, that in fact, if you think about legal judgments which have had material effects, if you think about the Hersey case, for instance, and I could expand on that, the very issue, its jurisprudential importance internationally outside the European Union, was that there are no spaces which are simply extraterritorial and where refugees or migrants cannot be protected. That's the landmark decision. Now, if that isn't a way of being able to think about extraterritoriality both in the legal sense, in the actionable legal sense, as well as an ethical claim, then I don't know what is. And clearly, if you think about it like that, it resonates with this idea, not that we have to do this, we have to rescue these refugees, otherwise we ourselves might one day be in that, not that moral intuitionist sense, but a much more complex construction that we belong in the same world, not because we are the same, but that in a way, the future conditional intensifies the commitment of the present. It is not now a contractual thing. You know, if I don't save you, you won't save me if my time comes. So that's the purpose of thinking in this way. You know, there's a very beautiful moment in a late Arendt essay called Thinking and Moral Considerations, which she dedicated to her good friend W.H. Auden. And there she is talking about various Greek thinkers, and she says, in a particular context, that there is a way, it's not enough to talk about the stranger or the other or alterity. It's not enough to simply acknowledge or recognize or respect, words that I tend not to use. She says, you understand that condition by activating the difference within yourself, as I quoted her today. There are two, you know, she says that it's the activation of that difference. Now, she elaborates it in a very beautiful metaphor. She said, you activate that difference when you go back home and you find yourself waiting for you a friend who is also your enemy, who makes you think about what your moral stance or what your ethical stance has been. So this notion of a time warp or a kind of a proleptic time of the future that you bring back into the present is for me very fundamental to the thinking of ethical commitment or ethical constitution. And yeah. Does that respond to your question?
Sure. Thank you, Professor Bhabha. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk about the mechanics of the process of making migration of the state of being a refugee the site of Jewish students. And I was also wondering if we make that the state of being a refugee the site of Jewish students, how would that regime of Jewish students interact with the institution of the nation state in a time such as this, when there is the talk of borders and walls?
Thank you very much. Look, at the conceptual level, I think I have said more than enough here, so I don't want to repeat myself. But Let's start with a brute material fact. Now what? There are 64.5 million people in the world who are who, let's call it, are rightless in some ways or another. They're refugees, but they're also stateless, rightlessness. They're waiting for their interviews or their visas or whatever. 64.5 million, I think, roughly. 64.5 million makes this the 27th largest nation in the world today. The 27th largest nation in the world today. Now, these, I suggest, are peoples without a nation, but they are a country. They might be a dispersed country, but they are a country. And we talk about continually about transnationalism, about diaspora. They are changing, from my point of view, in keeping with my talk here, where I take risk and the unprotected as the site of the enunciation of policy, not the rational choice approach. If you think about that, 64.5 million people who are named and unnamed at the same time, then you have to think that the very nature of citizenship and national affiliation or belonging has this alterity now internally written into it. This is not simply that we are citizens and they are not citizens, or we are migrants and they are not. It is internally written into it, and I'm saying this in a positive way. It makes us rethink the whole model of what our commitments are, who we are as citizens. That's one. But it's also in a negative way written into it. Just think of the statement made that I heard on CNN 2 nights ago about the separation of these of the children. And a Republican thought leader, I forget his name, said, but of course, having these undocumented children are a danger to our children. They are a danger to our children. They are a danger to our homes. So see, even there is an acknowledgement of even at the point of rejection. Do you see what I'm saying? There is an acknowledgement, although phobic, of the internal, the internalness, if I might put it, of these conditions. These conditions are no longer, and I hope my paper has made it clear, no longer simply political conditions or psychological conditions. They're profound ontological and political conditions of our times. And just as we started talking about the bourgeois notion of rights, we start talking about we talk about the bourgeois individual subject, etc., etc. I tried to argue here that this phenomenological, ontological position, death, life, is not the only, but it is another urgent basis for constructing our political categories, our psychic categories, and our ethical categories.
How might you, or might you not, compare some of what you're saying about the right to have rights and how it merges that perfectly with Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's notion of capabilities with which every human being comes into the world?
Thank you, Don. Well, first of all, I think we are both targeting the same people. Amartya and Martha's work, it was written against the kind of rational choice tradition, where there are what's the word I want to use? Where there's a particular model of what it is to be an economic subject, what it is to succeed, and that, I think, is where we stand together with capabilities. I think that their notion of capabilities, particularly Amartya's, which is very productive because it is normatively supple. You know, there are no kind of norms for this. Capabilities depend on where you are, who you are, and what you're doing in order to fully envisage your own capacities, your own future, your empowering. I think that they are still more on the how shall I put it? They still work more on the more empirical tradition, whereas I think in the more phenomenological, from the more phenomenological perspective. For me, it's important that we change the thing we call the subject before we start thinking about citizenship, law, etc. I think that, so that's my first point. They don't do, I think they accept that the notion of personhood, or they accept the concept of the individual, only their calibrations of what it means to be able to achieve one's sense, a full sense of being, happens. I think that we would be different at that level. I'm trying to think, it's a very good question. I'm also, capabilities is not rationalist necessarily in the kind of procedural or prosaic way in which rational choice is rationalist. I don't believe it is that. But I still believe that the subject of capabilities is less open to the psychic and the affective realm from which I am speaking. I think this is quite true of Amartya. It is less true of Martha Nussbaum, because she is interested in psychic states and affective states. But I think in that realm or that way, we would have a very different notion of the way in which ontology and representation work. You know, what is the subject? And I think we would have a very different way of thinking about that. Right? So really for them, it's how to change the matrices of evaluation of the person. But I don't think it's inquiring into another mode of subjecthood. And I think I'm interested in, at that level, changing the way we think of subjecthood or the sujet d'énonciation, the subject in language and discourse, changing those terms. I think, of course, there's the final difference between us is that I think I'm very interested in a whole tradition, a philosophical tradition, of French theory, of of continental philosophy, whereas I think they are less so. They begin from a very different tradition, which is why I would say I'm trying to change the subject, and they're trying to change the evaluation of subjects.
I shouldn't speak for them, but for them the subject would appear to be the body, which is what emerges at birth, and that built into that body are these capabilities.
Yes.
The body understood to include mind as well as the physical.
Right. No, that's right. And I think that's exactly where they would, that's exactly the difference between us. For them, it is that body with its given qualities or capabilities. Mine is not a given body. It's a body constituted through its interpolations in law, education, religion, whatever. I think we have a different notion of what the body is and how the person gets constituted and what the agent is and how the subject gets placed. Is that?
Thank you for that very informative talk. You mentioned Levinas several times in your sort of lecture. Can you hear me? And I was wondering what your thoughts were, how you would think through Levinas's concept of absolute hospitality and kind of the theoretical limits associated with that, which is, at least to me, implicit in Levinas's, almost in this notion of absolute hospitality, negation of the self. And I was wondering whether in your reconceptualization of migration and extraterritoriality, can we even conceive of it through the guise of Levinasian's absolute hospitality?
You know, yes, I mean, the metaphysics of absolute hospitality, I admire and appreciate. My question really is how ethical decisions and choices, I won't say fall short, but have to, particularly when there is an institutional impact, and that's why I talk about the law, because you cannot, think about, I talked about literature, I talked about journalism, but you have to talk about the law, because these definitions are very legal, and whether people can move, what rights they have. So I think that the idea needs to be kept and revered, not revered, but certainly understood, but in other ways it needs to be transformed, and that's what I've been trying to do in my own way, using it to illuminate particular moments, which may not be entirely true to Levinas, but then I've never given much quarter to being true to anybody. I used what I thought, changed it. This may have been the hubris of hybridization. I've used it how I felt I needed to use it, and then people are free to say, this is bullshit. But I've used it to answer a problem. For me, that's why I've never been. I mean, the Derridians always said, you're a fake Derridian, you're not really a Derridian. The Lacanian said to me, you use Lacan, but you're not a Lacanian. This doesn't bother me at all. I'm interested in thinking a problem. And I will do whatever I need to do to think the problem.
But if I may, just invite you to speak a little bit more on this problem, this topic. So I remember during the conference on populism, some among us at a certain point said that the only thing that knocked out that populism is the root populism. And so my question to you would be, to what extent is the politics of barbarism an extreme version and perversion of even the state's ideology of sovereignty and security? To what extent is that politics of barbarism leading to what you beautifully phenomenologically described as the problem of dishonor? To what extent is that not best answered, even in Levinasian terms, with a good barbarism of sort? And you know very well that when Levinas decries the breakdown of institutions and the state and everything that comes with it in your terms, including policy and vegetable choice, he somehow invokes as a last resort, as the very locus of the ethical, if extraterritorial, not of this world, the dimension of interiority and even spirituality. And one could say, even on Levinasian terms, that that's a form of barbarism that borders upon the ineffable. So would you be willing to say that given the different paradigm that you laid out, premised on risk in particular, one could and perhaps should, or has perhaps no other alternative but to somehow wager another kind of barbarism that is indeed, as you beautifully put it, a form of non-rational choice, theory, and policy, to the point of absurdity, to the point of barbarism.
Well, that's a very seductive question, and I go with you, much of the way, and I know what you're saying. After all, there is also a Benjaminian notion of barbarism, which I was just thinking about, which is actually, I think goes to some extent in the direction in which you're going. Yes, I believe that when you take the risk, you risk, the risk has both the beautiful barbarism and it also has the populism. It also has the populist barbarism. But the beautiful barbarism is a translational mode. You know, the beautiful barbarism tries to find another language, right? If I get you right, tries to find another language, but it is transformative and translational in a sense. The bad barbarism the bad barbarism has no courage. The bad barbarism always has to present itself as the victim. It is always, it's in a way almost self-debasing. You know the Auden poem, how he survived, and this is written, how he survived them they could never understand. So the bad barbarism is narcissistic, the bad barbarism is entirely projective. The good barbarism is when you take it within and you begin to activate those differences within. The good barbarism has an alterity to it. The bad barbarism has no alterity to it. This is why in the Eichmann book, I mean, my reading of Arendt's Eichmann book is basically that Eichmann could never, as she put it, activate the difference. That's why he embraced everything, you know. Yes, I was terrible. Yes, now that you tell me that I was terrible, I believe I was, you know, not terrible. So I think the question is the alterity issue. The good you get what I'm saying? The good barbarism has that alterity, that internal torsion, the agony. And the bad barbarism does not. It is only a barbarism of narcissism and similitude. It doesn't listen. It can't hear. So if one is the barbarism of alterity and difference, the other is the barbarism of disavowal. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
My name is Raphael Lemkin from the Melbourne University. And I was curious to hear if you could say a little more about where the intervention is intended to land, so the audience for this intervention of a change of focus. And maybe to make it more clear, what I mean is if you refer to the Husey judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, and I wonder if you could say more about what you think in that judgment went right, or where did something happen that was different that gives reason for hope? Well, is it in a sense in the law, that the law in the convention allows for extraterritorial understanding of jurisdiction? Is it in the minds of the judges that interpreted it in a way that was desirable, or is it in a sense in the pleadings on behalf of Husey that made a point that resonates with what you said? So I think I'm just wondering to where this is addressed, or is it a civil society conscience idea? Yeah.
Well, I think I said, not only I said, because, you know, what do I know about the law? I read the law in a very particular way, but I think that the general sense amongst legal scholars was that it's a landmark decision because it made extraterritorial jurisdiction a reality, a normative idea as part of a customary law that would extend outside of the European Union. Now that is surely a major step. I think that's a very important issue. It also established that collective expulsion is a habeas corpus. Is a issue. It's an issue. You cannot have collective expulsion because you've got to listen to every single case. Now, these were the link between non-refoulement as a jurisdictional issue and the demand, which is the more jurisprudential demand, that every case has to be heard independently before you can send somebody anywhere. The link between the jurisdictional and the jurisprudential is the connection that they showed. And that's a link also between history and narrative, if you like, between law and ethics. So it's a very, I couldn't unpack the whole thing here, but that's, I think, a very important issue, which is why it has the landmark status that it has. So I think on these grounds, it speaks, then I enter the debate. And I don't simply enter it as a lawyer. I enter it with my philosophical interests, with my philological interests, and I begin to show how this kind of thinking across the law and ethics is about civil society discussion as well as about the law. It's about the cultural and theoretical representation of a problem as it reflects also in the legal discourse. So my purpose is not simply to address one or another audience. I mean, my purpose today is to address this audience. But to show those bridges, to show the way in which there are resonances, to show that, not if you buy the whole Levinasian package or the whole, but if you transform or translate the Levinas in a particular way, it actually illuminates the legal and extends the legal ethics. Because of course, if you take the issue on collective expulsion, there you have the reason you need to get every story or every context of every individual is habeas corpus, and it's also to do with the individual, right? It's to do with, so that notion of the individual is different from the Levinasian ontology of strangers meeting at the point of their unconditional unconditionality. It's different. But for me to show that the more the traditional legal findings can also find in another tradition an echo that pushes them both forward. That, I think, is very important. That is why in the whole migration, in the legal history of migration and refugees, in my view, pushing the law to its liminalities are the only ways in which we've had to proceed. The 51 Refugee Convention, which is so much based on protection, on the notion of protection, now people are saying with climate change refugees, we should be thinking as not about protection, but about the displacement of populations. So there is a way in which if one is addressing literature or law or psychic responsibilities or spiritual or metaphysical issues, my approach is to try and see how unlikely bedfellows become good lovers.
Almost aligned to there's one more question.
Do you see what I'm saying? But sorry, just one second. The idea as to whether this was a matter of the judge, I have to rest the case on the fact that for me the important thing was the judgment. Whether the case was made in one way or another. I mean, the case was made, you can imagine how it was made. The Italians defended it. They said, no, we only rescued these people. We had no intention of... They said, no, the fact that you rescued them and you put them on an Italian boat means that you are jurisdictionally responsible. And then comes in the non-refoulement and also the question of listening to each story, of singularizing in an ethical sense, the subject of the law. The law looks at them as just as individuals. I wanted to extend on that and expand on that, but I couldn't do it, to suggest that here it's not only respecting each individual experience, that if you keep taking this against collective expulsion, if you keep having to listen to these individual cases, this is not simply a case-by-case issue in the traditional sense. It is to build a different archive, which then would impact on the law. It's a different discursive archive. I wanted to say that, and I just couldn't find a brief way of putting it. So the law respects the individual, but I'm suggesting ethically we respect the archive of all these experiences, which will then change some of the fundaments of legal decision making. And to me, to listen to one story after another has something of the touch of what Sheila Ben Habib calls democratic iterations. Although I have to say, that notion of democratic iterations is something that a problem like migration or expulsion keeps coming back in different narratives. For the law, it's always we will judge it on the case itself. But I'm saying that it builds up, for those of us who are interested in philology and philosophy, it builds up another archive, which is in a way, again, extraterritorial, because it doesn't fit entirely into the disciplinary prospectus of what is understood to be the relevance of the law or the boundaries of the law. Yep, sorry.
Christine from the University of Southern Denmark.
Of Southern Denmark?
Yeah.
Welcome.
So while you were talking about changing our understanding of the subject and putting the rest of the unprotected at the center of the politics, it made me think of Bhabha's concept of the precariousness of life. And that's sort of the same way of thinking through the problem, or maybe not. So maybe you could say a little bit of differences and similarities is very important, I know.
Well, let me just say this, and I'm going to be very brief on this. We can talk about it later. I mean, I think that I'll tell you what there's a lot of work on precarity as a generalized condition of being, and that's not what I'm doing. I'm talking about very specific moments. And because I believe I don't want a general ontological theory of the early 21st century subject. That does not interest me. I want to be able to get these moments of, yes, they are figurative, but they're also phenomenological. They're effective, but also they're ethic. I want to pull them out of, in a way, real-time events, and then develop a reading depending on the institutional context, the discursive context, the political context to which they relate. So I'm personally not interested in the general notion of precarity as the way of talking about the problems of our time. And let me just say something here that last week I gave a version of a part of this paper last week in Venice, and a friend of mine from Cambridge in England, who was very enthusiastic about it, came to me afterwards and made an excellent point. He said, this not knowing, this future conditional issue, the way I'm departing from moral intuitionism through this notion of alterity, he said, but of course, this can also be used for the worst barbaric populism. We will never know what will happen if there is miscegenation. We will never know. But again, I would say that the way I'm thinking about alterity is different from those identifications. But I have to make that clearer than I have made it today. I just was in Venice only 4 days ago, so I haven't had the time to sit down and make. But I do think that the cutting edge is really how alterity is developed. The idea that miscegenation will, in the unknowable future, if we don't stop immigrants now, then we will lose our identity as Americans. That has a much more progressivist timeline, a much more teleological timeline, very different from my thinking in the proleptic mode as the future in a way which has a temporal disjunction and actually creates a kind of a splitting in the present. You see, I think it's a different way of thinking of what is the unknown. One, I would say, is agnostic and ethical. It makes you put yourself in that place of alterity. The other one is against projective. They will come and they will create all these kids who they will create this miscegenation. The population will be mixed, etc. There is no return of time from an asynchronic moment. There is no break, which for me is very important. Thinking at the point of alterity, if I might put it that way, makes the difference between the tyrant's risk or the barbaric risk and the kind of ethical risk that I'm suggesting, which, without theorizing it so in the same way, Baldwin says something very similar. In fact, I've started working on risk in this context, very much in relation to Baldwin and Du Bois. And I have a whole chapter on Du Bois and Baldwin and the notion of death in their work.
Thank you, Homi.